Welcome to the dopamine module team. I want to break down dopamine. I want to talk about why it truly is what's known as the molecule of more, and it's just fucking essential to your success as a professional that is performance based. Obviously, being a closer, being in sales, maybe one day you have your own offer and you'll be in more an entrepreneurship game. So I kind of want to go through the science a little bit. I want to talk about what really makes it up. Why is this so important and vital? And then, of course, there will be actionables and takeaways as we move towards the end of the video, right? But like, let's waste no time. Let's dive right in. So you might be thinking, what really is dopamine all about? A lot of times we hear it's about, it's the reward chemical, it's the pleasure chemical. When obviously you have some sort of achievement, a big reward, oh, a bunch of dopamine. You're partying, you have a win, bunch of dopamine. This is true, but dopamine is really more about it's the chemical for pursuit. So it's about the drive and the ambition that you really have towards getting to your goals. And then upon you achieving those, there is another secondary dopamine release. But the primary is these cues along the way that basically give you motivation to get to your goals. So that's what dopamine is really all about. It's about motivation, it's about drive, it's about ambition, and it's about being able to be in pursuit of the things you're going after in life. So if you have very, very, very low dopamine, you're going to have very, very low levels of motivation and ability to have discipline when your motivation isn't there to continue carrying out the activities you need to do to get to your goals. So that's the first things first, right? Understanding what dopamine is about. It is the pursuit chemical in drive of going towards your goals. Dopamine is completely essential. Okay. Elevating your dopamine baseline. Elevating your baseline is so important. I want to give you a little bit of a story real quick. Sometimes you'll see individuals in life where they just tend to be like way more happier. Like they're just like always hyped up, like, yeah, like just ready to go. And then you just kind of have like those individuals that they're not depressed. You would think they're depressed, but they're not depressed. And they're just kind of like, yeah, just like just chilling. That all comes down to the levels of dopamine at any given time that they have in their bloodstream. Everybody has different levels of dopamine. There's obviously behaviors that cause you to release a lot more dopamine, others that help you build up your dopamine stores. But at the end of the day, we want to build ourselves into an individual to where we can elevate our natural dopamine baseline. Now, there's a few ways to do that, but really, this is more of a long-term play. This is a game that we're playing over an extended period of time. And what you really want to do is when you elevate your baseline, is understanding how is dopamine released? What things do I do that help me build dopamine? What things do I do that help me kind of release dopamine to the point where I don't have enough that I need to use and continue moving from there? So it's very important to understand that everybody has their own separate baseline, and the goal is to little by little elevate that baseline over time, more or less. Okay. The goal is to have a stable, high baseline, not have these massive peaks up and these massive troughs down. But how can we sustainably have little highs, right? We have little lows that we can control. And how can we maintain that steady baseline over time and little by little, as weeks, months, days, and years go on? How can we elevate that? So our natural levels of motivation and ambition, how do they stay continuously on the rise over that extended period of time? Okay. Now, dopamine is finite. You might be thinking, well, what do you mean by finite? Well, let's think of the opposite. Something that's infinite is something that lasts forever. Dopamine is quite the opposite. Every single day, dopamine has to be replenished, and there's tools you can use to replenish it. Yes, but we're going to cover that in a separate slide coming up. But when I say dopamine is finite, what I really want you to think about here is picture in your mind, right, a wave pool, right? You've gone to the amusement park, you've gone to the water park, right? Whatever it is, think of actually being in the wave pool, and there's always that one kid that goes for like the cannonball, right? Just jumps in the fucking pool, boom, and all the water splashes out. Think of that analogy or that equivalent as when somebody engages in something that's a very high dopaminergic activity, as we would call it, right? Eating a very, very highly sugar food, right? Or for example, watching porn, right? Or doing some kind of drugs, right? Very dopaminergic, very big release, giant splash. Now, if your dopamine is the amount of water that's in that wave pool, and that wave pool doesn't have more water really coming into it, it just has a finite amount. It only has a certain limited amount of water. Really, the what I'm getting here is we need to be careful with not splashing so much water out of this wave pool at a certain time, knowing we really can't refill that wave pool, at least not to the level that we're splashing water out. Again, there's things you can do on a daily basis to help put more water back in that wave pool, get more dopamine. But really, at its core essence, it's never going to equivalent to the amount of how much dopamine is going out versus what you can control and manipulate to bring back in. And that's why understanding that your dopamine is finite You have a very limited amount of it. Understanding how important it is for motivation, for your drive, for your pursuit towards your goals, you have to understand what things are going to be really good to put more fuel in the tank, more water in the wave pool, and how can I avoid those massive cannonballs that are really going to take me out of the game and make me feeling just so lethargic and weak because there's no more dopamine in that wave pool specifically. I like to talk about dopamine's ways. So the way dopamine works, and this is so perfect for tying back to sales, right? Because in sales, people will always go more in favor of maintaining and being safe and secure for what they have, right? They're more loss adverse than they ever will be in pursuit for pleasure and for greed and for more. Dopamine is very, very similar. Now, with dopamine, you have the pain and you have the pleasure balance, right? A lot of times we seek things that increase our dopamine, right? Things are going to make us feel good, things are going to make us feel more successful, even things of healthy dopamine. The problem with that is, and we're going to see this in the next slide, dopamine has a baseline. Again, everybody has a different baseline. We need to make sure that we are not doing things that tip the scale so much in one direction that because dopamine is biased, right, and dopamine has its own baseline, it's going to force itself to bring back the opposite direction, right? So I'm going to explain that way more in detail. But understanding the concept that dopamine's way is a pain and pleasure balance. And here's exactly what I mean by that, okay? Dopamine has a dopamine homeostasis. So anytime, okay, I'm just gonna take a super easy suggestion, right? Anytime you eat a food that's just like delicious, you're just like, oh my God, like that was so damn good. You release dopamine, right? You go above your baseline, you have a little bit of a peak, what dopamine knows, and it basically keeps like a memory of every time dopamine is released, every time dopamine is taken, every time dopamine is restored. It almost like it has like a track record that it, like a reputation it keeps basically stored in your own mind subconsciously. You don't really know it though, but your brain does. So every time you release some kind of dopamine or you do something to kind of build up more dopamine, your brain and your mind are aware of that. So if you go ahead and you eat a very good food that tastes delicious, right? Your dopamine spikes very, very quickly, the brain's like, wait, 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 we spiked. Hang on, hang on. I need to do the equivalent of going below baseline just so I can come back to my actual baseline, right? Now let's flip that on its ass. Quite the opposite. If I do something purposefully, right? And this is again going to get into more slides, it gets better and better. If I do something purposely to drive myself down into pain to the point where the body's like, well, wait, wait, there's pain coming, there's pain, there's not enough dopamine, we need to produce more dopamine. Then you forcefully, controllably, right, conditioning that dopamine, you come down below baseline, and then you start to kind of come back up. Whereas a lot of times when we kind of come up above baseline, we usually fall to that equivalent down below baseline, that trough, sometimes even deeper. So the key here is how do I maintain these peaks? How do I maintain these troughs? And how can I do it in a healthy way to where I can always be teetering and tottering around that baseline, but not to the point where I can't do anything that I want in life, and not to the point where I only need to do things that I hate just so I can get that dopamine or that happy motivation chemical release, right? And that's what brings us into the next slide, which is become him. I saw a phenomenal quote. It was by uh I think I want to say like John Jones or one of the UFC fighters. I think that was his name. So if I mess that up, just call me out on it. But he was on an interview, and I just remember this from one of the motivational clips I used to watch years ago. And he just had this one quote, and he was just like, "Don't be afraid to be that guy. Be the guy that endures pain, that is an advocate for sweat. Don't be afraid to shed a few tears. Don't be afraid to put in some blood, some hard work, and all that." And at the end of it, he summed it up by just saying, "Just be that guy, right? Just become him." And I love that because when we talk about dopamine in particular, again, if we conditionally, right, like not getting into pain, meaning like we have a sickness or God forbid, like, like you get your legs punched out or something, not that kind of, but something conditioned, right? Perfect example, like a cold shower or an ice bath, or just you have an impulse to do something and you say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's all forms of psychological, right, and physical pain. So the key here is if we can prioritize pain, right, we're at our baseline if we can prioritize pain and conditionally go down below baseline, for example, cold shower, ice bath, the body and the brain are like, wait, 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 we're down below baseline. Yo, we need to come back up, right? So then you forcefully come back above your baseline and you get that trough or you get that peak, excuse me, but then you teeter back on your baseline. Instead of what a lot of people will do, right, is they'll engage again in some kind of dopaminergic activity. Let's say they're working out and they had some caffeine, right? Maybe they had some pre-workout and they got music pumping and they're doing it. That's a lot of dopamine sources at one time, which we're going to talk about here in the slide coming up immediately. So what happens is they kind of stack these dopamine sources so quick, right, that they have this peak, they come above baseline, but because we went that high, again, the brain and the body are like, wait, we need to come back to baseline. We have to come back to one. So you have to come down to the equivalent of that trough, which is typically even deeper than the original peak that you had. But what's cool is if you flip that and you say, hey, I'm going to prioritize pain so I can unlock that peak naturally. My body's doing that. It's just carrying it out on itself, the brain. And then I come back to baseline instead of back below baseline. That's what we really want to be shooting for almost every single day, 4, 5, 6, 7 days out of the week. Really not every day, because then you build up a tolerance, which again, we'll talk about here in a second. But we really want to prioritize pain because on the other side of that pain is pleasure. When you prioritize pleasure, on the other side of that pleasure typically comes pain, right? So become that guy that wants to prioritize conditional pain first, knowing that you're going to get that boost. You're going to feel that adrenaline, that dopamine pulse very soon after, and then come back to baseline in a healthy manner instead of prioritizing pleasure and dopamine going first with that peak and then dropping below baseline in that trough and then slowly making your way back up to baseline. There's two different paths you can take. One makes it sustainable for lasting high energy, focus, clarity, motivation, the pursuit, the drive chemical, and one causes you to feel that crash, feel unmotivated, and just not getting shit done that needs to be done. Okay, so be that guy, prioritize that pain. Now, some of the dangers with this is right. I had a client in the past, and he absolutely started to really enjoy cold exposure. He really started to embrace that pain, that discomfort, right, which was awesome, and he started being extremely productive. But he started taking these ice baths. Sometimes it was an ice bath, sometimes it was a cold shower. He would start doing this every morning, right? It was a part of his wind-up routine, something he really loved to do. But just like anything else, his body and his mind built up a tolerance to that. Now, the danger with that is we need to use these tools like cold exposure and like the sauna, certain tools that we'll talk about more here in different modules. We need to use these tools strategically and also sometimes on a daily basis as part of our toolkit. So the problem was when this man was constantly taking this cold shower, unless he was always manipulating variables, which he wasn't, manipulating variables meaning, at what temp is the actual water. Sometimes it's hard to gauge, especially in a shower, right? Ice bath, it's a bit more predictable, right? How long he's in it, what different parts of the body, is he hitting differently on the different extremities in his body, and all these different things. It was very hard for him to start getting the same release and the same effect after he was doing this, for 2, 3 weeks straight. So we begin to dial it back, right? Give himself a bit of a tolerance reset, and then he would use it strategically. When he knew he had a big task in the morning, or he had sales calls on his calendar the next morning where he's like, okay, cool. Like these people have a higher likelihood of closing, might be a type A prospect, bit more of an ego. I want more of that edge. He would prioritize that cold exposure, knowing he was going to put himself in that pain to unlock that pleasure and more drive, more focus, more clarity, more energy. And he can utilize that and kind of like his most key hours for kind of closing the most important sales, highest pips, things of that sort, right? We time that properly on his schedule. So you need to be careful of not overusing these tools to where you build up a tolerance, but how you use them strategically and help that unlock that performance edge that ultimately we're all after. And that's why we're here, right? Now, if there's one way to fuck up your dopamine forever, one, this will tell you this, what I'm about to explain to you now is exactly how addiction happens, right? Whenever dopamine needs to be earned. So whenever dopamine is not earned and there's no effort involved before getting that release of dopamine, whenever there's no time delay involved with getting that outcome and it's just like immediate, that's where you fuck up, and that's how addiction works. So let me explain it real quick, right? I've never done this, but it's the easiest example I can think of. If somebody does a line of coke, right? Put it on there, they sniff it, whatever. It takes almost no time. It's immediate, right? And literally from them doing it and they're like, wow, like I just energy, focus, just waking up, like they feel great, right? I wouldn't know, I've never done it, but that's what I've heard. People feel great because there was no real effort involved and no time delay from them getting that outcome. That's why then as soon as he went above his baseline, he had a massive peak. Very shortly after that high ended, he had a massive trough. And when you have a massive trough going down, your body craves more dopamine more than ever because it has less dopamine in your body and in your brain because you just release so much by going so far above your baseline. And then your mind starts to play games on you and you start to do the same activity again, right? So then you do another line of coke, right? Or then you go get a girl and you go engage with her and go have sex with her, right? And then you just start to basically release more and more dopamine that your baseline just comes down further and further and further and further because you keep going for these peaks. And then the first peak is there, the second peak might be a bit bigger, and then that third peak is halfway there, not as much. So now you need twice as much stimulus, right? Twice as much coke, whatever it is, three times better sex, whatever it is, just to get that same level of release. And then you come crashing down harder even after, craving more dopamine because you keep going deeper and deeper down to eventually come back to your baseline where you can have some sort of sanity and keep moving forward, right? So if you do not want to fuck up your dopamine, you need to make sure that you regulate your dopamine releases. And we're going to talk about exactly what are the behaviors that release dopamine and what are the behaviors that we need to make sure we control that release and what can actually help us replenish dopamine on a daily basis. Okay. So that is how to make sure you do not fuck up your dopamine by don't constantly be chasing pleasure because then you build up a tolerance and it takes more and more of that same stimulus to get to that peak, which causes a deeper trough, which causes more craving for more dopamine without any sort of effort or time delay. And that is the exact loop of how addiction happens in real life, from drugs to anything that you can be addicted to. Okay. Now, the reason why you're going to win by understanding this module is because every time you have an all-time high and cash collected, or you have a massive milestone that you reach, or you bought your parents a house, you retired your parents, or you went on that vacation, when you share your wins with, I know this might sound counterintuitive, like, well, then what the fuck is the point of the journey? This is just from a science perspective. You do what you want, even though I would highly recommend against that. I recommend what I'm about to tell you. Anytime we have a personal win, right? Personal, financial, emotional, whatever it may be. When we share those wins with others, we release three times as much dopamine as we would just having that own internal feeling ourselves, right? So sometimes, as shitty as it might sound, do not share your wins with others, guys. Do not share the biggest cash collected month. Don't post it and then everybody's blowing up your stories or posting up your Instagram reel and you're getting all this dopamine, right? This validation, even though you're not looking for it. Yeah, you great did it. Congratulations, man. You have this giant dopamine release, right? And then boom, massive peak, right? You come so much down to your trough, right? And then it takes you more time to get back up to baseline. If you just keep that to yourself, you feel good about it. Now you have more dopamine, you have a higher baseline because you didn't release it. So you're more motivated, more disciplined, more consistent. You're even in further pursuit of that next goal that you're going after because you now have the dopamine there to pursue it. When you share your wins with everybody, right? When you have fun, when you go to the club, when you release all this dopamine, you have a massive peak, you have a massive trough that comes down below that. And that's when, again, you lose all that dopamine and it takes time to replenish it and get back to that neutral feeling of, okay, I'm now good to get back into my flow. So simply by not sharing your wins with others and keeping that internally, maybe just documenting them in your own way, you're going to hold on to so much more dopamine and use that as your fuel to your next goal and being able to do that way faster, way more efficient, and enjoy doing it versus releasing all that dopamine and then kind of having to wait around until you feel good again or feeling like you can get back into your flow and then pursue that next goal. Okay. That's why you're going to win just by knowing that. Now, optimizing your dopamine, just like everything to do with health, it's a every single day activity, right? Now, what I mean by that is there are certain tools you can use, right, to absolutely replenish dopamine. But the number one thing that basically takes like your dopamine from, where it is every day to full tank of gas the next day is by sleeping properly, making sure you have your 8 to 9 hours every single night. You're maximizing your QQRT. Your bedroom is set up, right? You've transformed it. You're getting the highest quality of sleep, the deepest, most restorative sleep you can get for the right amount of hours. You're consistent and you wind it down before that to optimize your sleep cycles, things of this sort. This is how you replenish the maximum amount of dopamine, right? And what's super important is doing certain activities during the day that can also continue to replenish the dopamine that you're naturally and in a healthy way going to use, like getting into your work, right? Working out, right? Hopping on a call with somebody that you enjoy or closing a sale or somebody. Those things are going to release dopamine. And although we still have a healthy amount, right, the wave pool is still pretty even. Little by little, naturally, we're going to start to deplenish that dopamine stores, which is why it's super important to not do behaviors that massively deplete it. Normally, it's going to come down. And things we can do every day to make sure we top up those dopamine stores are things, again, like optimizing our sleep, right? Making sure that we exercise and maybe not a full workout, some form of exercise, right? Cold exposure, some kind of sauna, right? An NSDR session or a guided meditation session. These tend to actually show results of replenishing certain dopamine stores within your brain, right? Other things you can do are different kind of relaxation tools, going out in nature, getting more sunlight, doing some form of grounding has led to increased dopamine stores as well. So things that become your everyday habits, things you do in the morning, things you do at night, things you do midday, eating a really, really healthy, balanced diet per your own data, that replenishes dopamine. These are all the things we need to do every day alongside making sure that we're regulating our dopamine and not releasing so much and getting the proper sleep to make sure not just a few days a week, but every day, 6 out of the 7 days in the week, we're energized, we're motivated, we're consistent, and we're further in pursuit of where we're going after in our life. What is that next goal that we're reaching for? We need to make sure we're optimizing our dopamine every single day, right? And in the next module, there's not a video, but there's a list of a bunch of things that are good dopamine and things that are bad dopamine. And think about it. Become him. Become that guy that we talked about, right? Prioritize that pain, unlock that higher level of pleasure, more pursuit chemical, more drive, more motivation, and then come back to baseline to continue moving forward, right? Now, let me tell you basically how you feel, which I kind of just did in the last 30 seconds, and what happens next, right? When you do this consistently and you build these anchors and you're conscious of how much dopamine you're releasing, what activities release them, what activities build them, you can start to understand, how do I maintain a baseline? And by maintaining that baseline for an extended period of time, I elevate my normal baseline, right? And if I do want to go above baseline, instead of doing something that immediately unlocks pleasure, let me put myself in pain first so I can naturally and in a healthy manner get to that level of pleasure. One thing I want to cover real quick before I think we wrap up this module right here is something that's super important. You need to make sure you don't dopamine stack. Now, what I mean by that is there's so many behaviors, even good behaviors, positive things, positive habits that release dopamine. If you stack too many of these at any given time, again, it's like a massive cannonball in that wave pool, and you're flushing so much of that dopamine out. A lot of water is getting splashed out of that pool. So we need to make sure that if we do, we have a nice slow dive into the pool, not a fucking cannonball that's going to just throw so much dopamine and so much water out of the pool. So I just want to give you guys a like probably 6 or 7 examples of things that release dopamine, and making sure that you're not doing any more than 2 or 3 sources at any given time. Max. Anything more than that, you're going to have a massive spike with a massive trough. When you keep it between 2 and 3 max, you have the little peak that goes up, right? And then you can kind of teeter around baseline. You're not going to have that massive trough. Now, some of those examples are going to be any kind of caffeine or nicotine, those spike dopamine. Almost anytime you eat anything, even if you don't like the way the shit tastes, you spike dopamine doing that. By getting into any kind of focused work or a sales call, even work you don't want to do, you release dopamine. When you listen to music, you release dopamine. Anytime you scroll, or even like you're watching an educational YouTube video, right? Even watching this video, you're releasing dopamine. Anytime you exercise, you're releasing dopamine. So one of the best examples I can give you is, think about when you go into the gym now, right? Or you see almost everybody in the gym. Typically, right, they would have maybe ate something, maybe like an hour, maybe 30 minutes, maybe even 2 hours before. They release dopamine there, right? Then they kind of take some kind of pre-workout or some kind of caffeine. Boom, more dopamine there. That's a second source. Then they go into the gym, or maybe they're at home, whatever. And they start actually working out. Boom, that's a third dopamine source, right? And then on top of that, then they got some music blasting in their ears, right? That's another dopamine source, right? And then an hour later, right, now they're hopping into more work with more music. That's more dopamine. So that's literally 4 or 5, 6 sources within just a few hours of the day of so much dopamine being released, and there wasn't that many activities that replenished it. The only activity out of all of those that I mentioned that would help build up more dopamine is just the exercise itself. But that maybe bumps you up 20% when you just release 75%, right? So that's when you're down 50% depletion in your dopamine by not being aware of these different dopamine sources and not regulating them properly. So you can still go above baseline, but when you have too many, you bring that trough. The goal is to either put ourselves into pain so we come back up and have that peak and then teeter around baseline, or we just naturally come above baseline a little bit with 1 or 2 different sources, maybe even 3, and then teeter around baseline, not come down in that trough. And if you do this properly, you're going to wake up every day energized, refreshed, mentally clear. You're going to feel motivated. You're going to feel excited. You're going to have more moments of joy, and you're going to understand how to regulate your own nervous and dopamine system for success by understanding how to regulate this molecule and use it and time it properly in a way that is going to help you set up your goals for future success and accelerate you to getting to them faster, sooner, and in a far more healthy way that is overall sustainable. So that's the presentation, guys. Check out the next module and check out exactly what are the great behaviors that are good things of dopamine, and also what are some things that are bad behaviors for dopamine. And do keep in mind, do not stack any more than 2 to 3 at one time. And the best way possible is making sure you go into some kind of pain first conditions and naturally let yourself come above baseline and then teeter at baseline and then keep moving forward.